The Buzz with Jess Lujan.
Good evening, Guam. I'm Jess Lujan. Welcome to this episode and new time and new date for The Buzz TV Live. And of course, Biba missed Samoru, and in celebration of that, I've got UOG Professor, the Dr. Michael Lujan Bavacqua, and also the Managing Editor for UOG, the University of Guam Press. We have Victoria Lola Leonguerrero.
Hafade.
Hafade. Buenas. How you doing? This month we're going to concentrate on political self-determination, different aspects of self-determination. So not one particular status, but just how we go about that. And hopefully next month with Dr. Underwood, President Underwood, hopefully we can concentrate and talk about the genesis, because he pretty much led, this self-determination process from there, his activism, and then on up to today. Okay, we'll concentrate on that.
Okay.
So good evening. Self-determination. When I talk self-determination, what is the self of determination?
Well, that's really a really important question that as a community we continue to have to answer, but it always is the same answer. The self is those who were colonized will decolonize. So in our case, it's the Chamorro people, or the native inhabitants of Guam, which by law right now, by Guam law, is defined as anyone who is made a citizen by the signing of the Organic Act in 1950 and their descendants. So that's what Guam law determines to be the self. But why that law protects the need for the native inhabitants to determine this is that the Chamorro people are the ones who were colonized, and therefore it is natural that we would be the ones to decolonize. And it's not to say that we don't like anybody else on Guam that isn't Chamorro, or that it's an act of discrimination. That's not what this is. It's more than it's not a civil rights issue, it's a human rights issue. And the wrong that was committed was done to the Chamorro people. Therefore, to right that wrong, the Chamorro people must be the one to determine this. And we have to keep in mind that a lot of people, even though Guam has become their home and they have been here for decades, many of them came because of the United States. So either as US citizens deciding to settle in Guam, or coming to Guam to become US citizens from other countries. So their interest in Guam is connected to our colonizer. And so in a decolonization process, you want to make sure that the interests of the native people to decolonize are respected and not influenced or overshadowed or overpowered by the interests of those that want to become part of the colonizer's country. So that's kind of, a good way to explain it.
Well, one of the things where it kind of gets muddied up here in regards, because you're coming from this aspect of self-determination based on non-self-governing territories, okay, as we are listed, having been removed from that. But that also applies to international law, okay? International law. When we look at that. Now, when people argue, well, wait a minute, because I'm a U.S. citizen and to deprive me of my right to vote is a discrimination process. Well, that's based on U.S. law. The United States has determined its political status, basically, when they fought for their freedom and their independence from Great Britain at the time. So the argument basically is supposed to be in two different courts. One of the international court in regards to self-determination, okay, because in the Constitution of the United States, it talks nothing about colonized countries or territories and their self-determination. This is in an international arena that we're placed on, and of course the United States has acknowledged that. Doc.
That is one of the things which makes the decolonization discussion very, very difficult for people, is because if you sort of hear in the media or from average people, you kind of get the sense that this is an issue of voting rights. This is an issue of sort of constitutionalism. The issue of the inorganicity comes into play. But if you're really looking at self-determination and decolonization, it has nothing to do with those things. It's it's an international process. It's about inalienable human rights. And so, but it gets mixed up in there because we're so used to basically the United States setting the rules for how we're supposed to live, setting the sort of the rules for the game that we play with our lives. And so it's hard for us to basically imagine that there's a whole different game out there with the completely different rules. And sort of we've been kept on the sidelines for so long. And we've got to get into this. And so decolonization will allow us to do it. But part of it is sort of breaking away from that American-centric mindset where we think that we can't violate the US Constitution with our decolonization vote. But just on the basis of it, if you're a colony and you're trying to decolonize, it doesn't make any sense that your colonizer set the rules for your decolonization.
Sure.
But when we hear people, Chamorros and non-Chamorros, arguing for that, and it doesn't make sense because, as Victoria said, this is like an issue of restorative justice, of righting a wrong, and you can't fix everything that colonization has done. But this is a symbolic act which the international community has recognized that your destiny, your political sovereignty was taken from you. This is the process that you take to sort of reaffirm it again, to gain it back. You, the native inhabitants, the indigenous people, the colonized peoples, you get to choose what happens next.
And not only with that the other nations has recognized that, as Guam has said, a non-self-governing territory. Also, your colonizer has recognized that as well. They themselves recognize, the U.S. recognizes as well that they do have territories that are U.S. territories, unincorporated territories, that again have not exercised self-governance, have not had the opportunity. So again, non-self-governing. They recognize that, and they've recognized that. Now, let me ask you this point, because prior to, say, Hawaii becoming a state, they were a incorporated territory with a promise of statehood, basically. We are an unincorporated territory, okay? What are the limitations then, of unincorporated versus again, what Hawaii was in the incorporation?
Well, I think a really interesting thing that came out of the conversation that was recently had at the Department of Interior, led by Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Esther Kia Aina, there, an attorney actually put it really simply and accurately that either you're a state or you're independent. That any status as a territory means that you're not in control. You have surrendered to the United States and to U.S. Congress to make decisions for you, to make ultimate decisions for you. And I think that's what's really important here is that as a territory, she even said the CNMI in Puerto Rico as commonwealths, they're still territories. They still are at the whim of Congress, right? And so that to me is the best way to answer this. It doesn't matter what fancy name you call your territorial status. A territory means you belong to another country, that you are not a self-governing people. And so, the question comes back to us, do we want to be self-governing or not? And that's really what needs to be decided.
Yeah. Well, when did it evolve to this? Because when I was growing up, we were always Guamanians, Guamanians, okay? And then they ask you, what are you? Oh, we're a possession. We're a possession. So when did this evolution of Guamanians to Chamorro, now from a possession to unincorporated? So how is that? I mean, it's just semantics?
Go ahead.
So the term unincorporated has been there for a while, even if people on Guam didn't necessarily sort of use it. I mean, if you want to put it specifically, Guam is an organized unincorporated territory. It was previously an unorganized unincorporated territory, but then the Organic Act makes it so you can say it's fancy organized now. And so, we really have to thank a lot of the consciousness building that has taken place on Guam. Because after World War II, our people were kind of in shock at the trauma of the war. There was a lot of gratitude, and people were feeling wronged in some ways, but they weren't asking a lot of questions. And it took another generation to come out. And recently, one of the people who was asking a lot of those questions, Bennett Dunca, she passed away. But her, Robert Underwood, Hope Cristobal, and others were really there to push the issue of, what are we? Are we Guamanians? We used to call ourselves Chamorros. Are we U.S. citizens for real? Are we indigenous people? And so in sort of those discussions, they've really pushed the consciousness of not just Chamorros, but even non-Chamorros, to think that Chamorros are an indigenous people who have certain rights. And so because of those efforts, now even the government of Guam has responded and basically said, this is our position, that the Chamorro people have these rights per international law, per international agreements, and so we will protect them and we will promote them.
Now, going back to this, because when we had a vote last years back for Commonwealth, okay, and people decided that's what they want, and of course we know what happened. At the time as well, there was a move. Some people wanted status quo. What status quo? Okay, I know former Senator Francisco Santos at the time, of course, status quo was not an option. You can't call it status quo. So they had to name it, unincorporated, basically, right? Unincorporated. So, you still have writers now. You still have people that said, hey, one people want status quo. Let's vote for status quo. I said, it's not an option. It's not a status. So you guys are academia. What does status quo mean?
Well, currently the options that are available according to Guam law are independence, free association, and statehood. And so even though, as I mentioned earlier, right, it's really kind of boils down to are you a territory or are you independent? I think what we're looking at is the three options we have determine whether or not we want full incorporation into the United States, which is the option of statehood. That means that we surrender that decision completely to Congress, right? So they would need to determine whether or not they want to make us a state. Free association is similar to what we see with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau, where they're basically independent, but they have a relationship with the United States, and they've determined the nature of that relationship.
Mutually consenting, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So,
kind of
depending on how you look at mutual consent. And then, of course, independence, meaning then that Guam would be an independent nation. It doesn't mean that Guam doesn't have to have any relationship with the United States. It means that Guam can negotiate that relationship. So say, for example, Guam were to become an independent nation, but still wanted a United States military presence on the island. The island nation of Guam, the country of Guam, could enter into a status of forces agreement with the United States, in which they will determine the terms of that, whether or not they pay rent for those bases.
And how they write their constitution, basically, right? I mean, based on how that's written.
Well, if we become independent, we determine our constitution.
Determine constitution. We're going to take a quick break, a much needed break, come back, talk more about this, and then, again, how do we establish that? That's the question, ongoing question. Be right back.